Well, welcome back to the R5 Ministries YouTube channel. I was reminded on Sunday by a brother in our church fellowship that I ought to say like, comment, and subscribe. But we're going to jump back in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we're getting into part 2. So last time we looked at verses 6 through 7, and especially we looked at the fact that Paul warned the Corinthians that they ought not be idolaters, as some of the fathers, the Exodus Christians, were, or the Exodus Israelites were when they came out of Egypt. And he said, and he quotes the Old Testament, he quotes Exodus when he says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And that was dealing with the account of the golden calf. And we remember that. So then in verse 8, he's going to move on and give a second example of what they ought not to do, of the lesson that they ought to learn from the example of the Exodus Israelites. And so that will be in verse 8. But I'm just going to back up to verse 1, read through verse 13. This is one whole section. And so I'm going to go and read that as we get started. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. And 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. I keep wanting to get to the destroyer. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. And then we'll just add this. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So here he's telling them, flee from idolatry, just like he warned them in the verse 7, like we talked about last time. But we're going to pick up in verse 8. In verse 8, he says, we must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. So we want to note, he's going to give us these 4 examples. And you can see each example. Verse 7, it says, as some of them were. Verse 8, as some of them did. Then again in verse 9, it says, as some of them did. And then again in verse 10, as some of them did. So we see those 4 examples, verses 7, 8, 9, 10. But we're looking at the second one. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Well, what is he talking about? Well, we must understand, when we go back into the Old Testament, we're going to find several things. And we may even call this a bit of the Bible gone wild kind of thing, because this is one of the most extreme, amazing stories in the Old Testament, in terms of just how graphic and how really amazing it is, both the sin of the people and how that was atoned for and turned back. And we're going to see that. So here Paul is dealing with a specific time. He says 23,000 fell in a single day, and we'll see why the number isn't the most important part, but the fact that this reference points us back to a certain event, and that event is found in Numbers 25. And so let me just read to you the story. If you've never read this story, this may be one of those things that you will be amazed is in the Bible. In Numbers 25, while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. Notice the language here. It says the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And so that's our sexual immorality. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So we need to see the connection between the sexual morality and the idolatry. So we don't want to miss that. Those two things are both there. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and that is an example of the idolatry. And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel. So they're worshiping this false god, this idol, and God is angry with Israel. And Yahweh said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before Yahweh, that the fierce anger of Yahweh may turn away from Israel. Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Now, how had they yoked themselves to Baal of Peor? Well, remember, they had bowed down. They had submitted themselves. They had offered sacrifices and ate. This was a fellowship that they had. And they were engaging in sexual immorality. All of these are how they had yoked themselves to this false god, this idol. And so it says in verse 6, and behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family. Notice what it says, in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel. Notice how brazen. While they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. So the people of Israel are weeping over, remember they've killed those who are yoked to Baal of Peor, or many of them. And the people are weeping over the judgment and over the sin, hopefully. And this person, in just brazen defiance of the Lord, in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the whole congregation, they're not hiding it. This person's not, they're acting shamefully, but they're not acting ashamed as they're acting shamefully. While they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. So I'm sure you can imagine, we don't want to be any more graphic than the Bible is. I don't need to explain exactly how this took place, because you can read it right here. He rose, left the congregation, took a spear in his hand, went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. And then notice, thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. So this is what Paul is referring to. And we know that because in verse 9, it says, nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. Now you may say, whoa. 24,000. Paul said 23,000, right? That's what he said. 23,000 fell in a single day. So this isn't the same account, but it is the same account. Sometimes when you go from the Hebrew to the Greek, when you go from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there are different there being different manuscripts and manuscript evidence and all those things. There's all kinds of different reasons why the number may not line up exactly, but we can tell from that the direction this is pointing us, that Paul is referring to, is back to this occasion. And even if we didn't know that this was the occasion, this is the kind of occasion that Paul is talking about. So Paul is talking about a time when the people, and I would say he's talking about this occasion right here, when the people were being sexually immoral, and that was bringing the judgment of God, not only because of the sexual immorality, but notice it's sexual immorality. Notice it is sexual immorality, whoring with the daughters of Moab. It is the people sacrificing to their gods and fellowshipping with them. The people ate and bowed down to their gods. It's all of this. And so we see Phinehas here. He has a reaction of righteous indignation against this evil. And so he goes and he exacts the judgment of God. Thus, the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Then look at what it says in verse 10. And Yahweh said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. So Yahweh commends Phinehas for really having his heart. And then I want you to notice what he says in verse 12. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. Now, this is an interesting phrase, covenant of peace, because covenant of peace is found later in the prophets. It's only a couple of times in the entire Bible, but it's found later in the prophets. And it's referring to forward to the new covenant. And so it's interesting that it's used here. God pointing out that Eliezer is receiving his covenant of peace. And it says in verse 13, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him the covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God. The covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. So he made atonement by putting to death the man and the woman as they were in the very act that we read about earlier in verses 7 and 8. So the name of the slain man of Israel who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Asalu, chief of a father's house belonging to the Simonites. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, who was the tribal head of a father's house in Midian. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, harass the Midianites and strike them down, for they have harassed you with their wiles and beguiled you in the manner of Baal, in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the chief of Midian, their sister, who was killed on the day of the plague on account of Peor. So what we want to notice in this, what we want to see, is that when Paul references this account in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is referencing when this took place. And he's pointing out that the Corinthians, who are living in a pagan and Greek and Roman culture with all kinds of sexual immorality, involved in the worship of the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, and Paul is warning them, just like the Exodus Israelites were tempted and sinned by indulging in sexual immorality, which ultimately was idolatry, just like they did, the Corinthians would be tempted to sin in the same way and receive comparable judgment. And we ought to learn today that we could be tempted to sin in the same way and receive comparable judgment. And so we want to understand that here, Paul is pointing us toward the importance of recognizing God's grace in the example that he gave us in the Old Testament Israelites, and how that ought to be a lesson to be learned for the New Testament Corinthians and for us even today in the new covenant as we follow Jesus Christ. All right, well, we're going to leave it there, and we'll pick up next time with verses 9 and 10, and we'll try to cover that in one video. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.